the backlash. I started judging, waiting for that other shoe to drop, like they were going to say something. You know what I mean? It was very interesting. So anyways, I opened that door as one example. But realize, and again, I'll come back to this, forgive me. Okay. So, what does it mean to be punched by God? I think the big thing here is when churches cause people to experience, and you don't have to use this as your notes, when churches cause people, or the community of churches cause people isolation, abandonment, or a lost relationship with God. That is something that we feel, we attune ourselves and we say, man, I'm feeling punched by God. I'm feeling, spiritually abused. I'm feeling spiritually isolated. I'm feeling unconnected. I'm feeling controlled. And those things are really, really important. The loss of emotional, physical, or spiritual safety in a church community is being punched by God. When we experience this hardship, and it's there everywhere, when we experience it, we're feeling that, sometimes we feel that God is mistreating us. It's like, why would God allow that? And the reality is God isn't. It's people who use God and speak for God in a way that's not God's way of speaking. Definition of punched by God or spiritual abuse is really based on faulty human understanding of God. Faulty human understanding comes from our experiences, what we grew up with, what we didn't grow up with. I grew up, my mom was a Catholic. My dad and mom were classic Catholics, very abused Catholic situation. And don't get me wrong, I do love the Catholic Church. One of the reasons I love it is because of the reverence. When I go to a contemplative prayer times or pastoral thing, I love the sense of reverence that they have. But it was in a very abusive situation for my parents. My parents became non-believers, and then we went through the Buddhist track, the Quaker track. We went through everything you could possibly think of, and then some, and continued on. But the sad thing is that, really the understanding is that my parents' understanding of God was a knee-jerk reaction. So when we grew up, we didn't grow up with a faith. It was like, we do not want you to grow up with what we grew up with. We don't know how to control that, so we're not going to have any faith experience whatsoever. And in one way, that was a loss too, because it was based on complete fear and kickback to, there was oodles of other possibilities in the Christian community back then. I mean, pretty dark back then, but still. But anyways, so religion or legalism is another word that we get caught up with when we talk about being punched by God. And that's something, too, that I want us to keep our eyes open to. Basically, God is brokered through broken relationships and how we see and what we experience God to be. So as we teach and preach, the royal we again, going back to that, teach and preach or caretake or minister to, whether it be kids, whether it be other adults, new people, we all come to the table with the brokenness. All of us do. And how we sometimes come to God that way, or understanding of God, is through a broken shield. And so part of our brokenness needs to be healed as leaders and identify what is broken, which is hard. I don't want to be broken as a leader. I like to think I've got my stuff together, I've processed, I've worked through it. But in reality, I'm a human being. My filter is of a human being. And so my fear of being hurt in the church, or to hurt others in the church, or to recognize people who might have been abused, such as kids or adults, whatever, all comes from my personal lens and experience of growing up in the church. I grew up where I constantly had to pray for fear that if I didn't pray it just right, I'd go to bed at night and I would do the Our Father, the Hail Mary, and then there was something else I would do. And I would do it in the order that, and if I would just do it just right, and I'd have to just fold hands just right, and I'd have to, do the whole thing when I was laying in bed. And then if I skipped a word or I messed up, because, it's 9 o'clock at night, I'm tired, I'd have to start all over again. And I would do this over and over until I got it right. Because once I got it right, then I know God would hear it. Well, what the heck's that about? You know, I mean, as a kid, and to think that that's such a pressure that, you know, and all the weights and worries that you deal with as a kid and not praying the correct prayer or using the right word would stop that vertical connection. You know, it's a shame, actually. But these are the things that we grow up with. So as a pastor later, did that not affect me? Yes. I had to unlearn, you know, it's not like, you know, I still use that later, but in the depths of who I am, that's something I had to unlearn. And realize that God loves me, grace, mercy, and all. I don't need to have the right words at the right time in the right order. And that's something that, you know, you teach others, things of that nature. So remember, God says there's no fear in me. And I thought, wow, how nice. Because I've been so fearful for so long. Fear is a huge one that creates people to feel that they do not trust churches, and or that they've been attacked or abused, like Laura had mentioned, that she experienced a very difficult situation. And you know, one place you feel safe for one moment, and then something comes out in your life or what you do, and all of a sudden that safety place becomes like a viper pit. And you're lost and crushed and confused and thinking, I was safe for so long, how could that happen? You know, what's the point of, you know, when we talked about love, when we were talking a little bit downstairs, we're going to talk a lot about love up here. You know, God loves us, and he modeled that love through Jesus. Jesus came here for a short 3 years to really show and say, this is what love looks like. Let me show you. Let me love on you. Let me teach you what love looks like. Let me show you what God looks like. And that's all I'm going to do. Model, model, model. So Jesus, throughout his 3 years of hardcore ministry, he taught, he preached, he healed, he loved. And then it was time to go. And he said, you know what? Now it's your job to teach, preach, heal, and love. You can do this. And we forget about that. You know, we talk about programs, and we talk about, you know, butts in the seats, and we talk about, gosh, why did that woman, you know, raise her hands above her head when she's up front? She could have easily done that in the back seat of the church. No one would have noticed her that badly. I mean, there's so many things that we take account for, you know, that we nickel and dime ourselves for as leaders. You know, how many kids are showing up for Sunday school? All of the things when we should be saying, how many people are being loved this week? How many people did I love this week? How many people did I look at in their eyes and say, glad to have you here, really? And if we do that as leaders, and we help our community, I was telling Ben earlier, if we model what we expect in our community, just like Jesus modeled what he expected in a loving relationship, we would have never known. If Jesus just basically talked, and we never saw the hands, feet, and voice of what he did, I don't think we would have gotten what God was about. That's my opinion. Now, I believe in multiple intelligences, and I believe that people have different learning styles and all that kind of stuff. I'm a person that loves all parts and pieces in the learning process. I want to hear it, I want to see it, I want to experience it, I want to feel it, I want to be a part of it. And Jesus was a hands-on teacher. When he spoke, he taught with it. He modeled all that he needed. We're to do the same, especially in our church communities. I love this scripture here. It says in Matthew 11:28-30, and it was done in the Message. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me and get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I will show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me and watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting upon you. Keep company with me and you will learn to live freely and lightly. That's the church. He's not just talking about Jesus, but he's talking about, his love and whatnot, but he's talking about us. We are to help people learn to live unforced rhythms of grace. We are to help people as we lead in our community and love in our community to feel free and light in relationship with the Lord. I think the thing that we run into too is when people, and we're going to move away from this because we're going to start talking about solutions, but spiritual abuse or being punched by God is also something that can be very subtle. Very subtle. The concept of, let's just talk about Christian denomination. That's not subtle, but we're going to go to subtle in a minute. Christian denominations, how we worship and follow God and understand God is the right way. Well, aren't we are the body of Christ? Why is one more or less than the other? And as leaders, how many times have you, tongue-in-cheek it too, how many times you've heard pastors or leaders up at the pulpit say, oh, those Lutherans, or, well, the Catholics do this, or right away we are contributing to a negative nod toward the other Christian communities. And religion is not about how God wants it. It's basically how we try to understand God. So religion's going to be broken, period. But it's a way that we can kind of understand him, box him in a little, grasp it. Because really, can we really grasp the big guy? Nah. So how do we articulate the big guy? Religion. And every form of religion has their way to go about articulating and understanding and sharing and modeling God, modeling Jesus. And when we step away and say, okay, it's different, it's not how I would go about it, but it's sure, I can understand, there's a sense of empathy and compassion that we have for other Christians in the Christian walk. People are like, well, what do you deal with the judgmental folks, the people who are so black and white? Well, there's black and white all over the world, When you look at Islam or you look at other areas, when people say, my gosh, 9/11. Well, do we look at that experience and say everybody of that culture fits that group of people who made that choice? No. Same thing with Christianity. It's a 1%. I got to tell you, we have some really squeaky people in the world. That old squeaky wheel gets oiled. Whoever squeaks the loudest will get the most attention. And the sad thing is we as people will say, well, that's all of Christianity. Well, it's not. What about the rest of us that live and would like and desire to live God out loud in love and passion, mercy, and grace? So, I think as we have to be very careful what we agree to or what we say, yeah, you're right. Those Catholics do suck or whatever. We have to realize that we are contributing to kind of a punch by God mentality when we start picking on other religions or other denominations. Church leadership, focus on leaders rather than actually God. That's a hard one. But it's out there, and it's promoted. And, if I'm going to be in alliance or have a faith towards God, am I going to do it through another individual, or is it going to be my relationship with God? And sometimes, churches will demand that hierarchy relationship as these guys are the big dogs, they're most connected. They have the ear to the big guy. And in all reality, that's so not true. We all know that. But that's a way that people use to be punched by God. That's a way to have spiritual abuse happening in the church, where we disempower people to have have their own relationship because we have to do it through somebody else. You know, as I grew up in the Catholic Church, for example, I had to move through saints. And I had to move through Mary to talk to Jesus. I was taught that, I was told that, and I had to respect that. I remember as a little kid thinking, that just seems so odd, you know? And I remember always talking to Jesus, kind of then apologizing, saying, Lord, forgive me. I know I should have gone through Mary first, but it's kind of like I just really wanted to talk to you. So I would apologize first, kind of preemptive strike, and realize that was such a strange place to be. Unwavering styles of preaching or teaching or worship or music. This is the correct form of how we go about worshiping God. Is also forms of spiritual abuse or to be punished by God. And when we teach that to our community, when we teach that to our kids, they grow up with, oh, I'm sorry, but, just like what I was doing. And I think that we have to really be careful. We need to celebrate the differences. And it's hard. We were just talking about that earlier. How do you go to change without making people nervous? Or how do you go to change without making people critical? How do you go to change without making people saying, you know what, that's a nice idea, but man, it wouldn't happen here because this is the right way to do it. This is the only way to do it. And that's something that we deal with all the time. Kitchen volunteer, we had a kitchen volunteer who had a lot of money. You guys might appreciate this. A lot of money, and they ended up redoing the kitchen for us. Which was really nice.
Straight to dash.
And just the kitchen.
Yeah, this was not at the UCC. This is not at the UCC. This is another kitchen. And I remember the person did it, and they were all excited. And plus, this individual was really organizer. So not only did she go in and moneyed it out, but she also went and organized shelves and all of this. Well, we have a kitchen committee. That went over like the lead balloon from hell. I mean, it was awful. And we didn't have the heart, the top leader then didn't have the heart to say, don't touch, because the money was involved, right? So here comes this flood of money we really needed. Here comes this woman with a great heart we really needed, but not once was there a guided practice on let's get the kitchen committee and you together and talk. And so then all hell broke loose, So-and-so did this to my kitchen. They shouldn't have touched my stuff. This is my space. How dare anybody come in here? And then it got to be like personal integrity stuff. That person's a real blah, 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 blah. Triangulation. I mean, it just went from, wow, wasn't that nice that there's a lot of dollars that came into our kitchen? And in turn, it became this worst fight among a number of women, husbands and wives, and people thought, I'm leaving the church, I'm taking my refrigerator with me. I mean, it was bad. And it all started with the good intention of, I'm going to go ahead and help my community. But it became an abusive situation that quick. And a lot of it could have easily just stopped if we at the top said, communicate to, this is what we expect. And here are the expectations, here are the boundaries. This is a gift. Let's deal with it. But in turn, it became a very ugly, huge, violent mess emotionally. Excuse me, I'm gonna cough. So these are things that we talk about. Sorry, it's really true. So, spiritual abuse. Other things that I think we need to really be careful of, and I'm on page 3, is that we have two types of lenses that we look at. And I think our understanding of spiritual abuse in the church, we have to understand that people come into the church with different lenses. One, there's a God lens, and then there's a humanity lens. And the humanity lens comes in with oodles of backgrounds. The God lens, I look at that, the great scripture here is Matthew 7, 24, 27, the wise men and the foolish builder, where you build your house on rock or sand. And the rock combination is, to me, is grace, mercy, and love. Grace, mercy, and love. The sand is everything else. You know, and I think sometimes we as churches, as leadership, will tend to build our foundations on, sure, we'll take a little bit of what Jesus said and God said, but then, you know, there's certain things we have to have too. And we put the human lens and the God lens kind of on equal ground. Well, right away, you're mixing sand and rock, and that will always, always fall short. Some might use a little more sand or less, but eventually that sand is going to shimmy that foundation, and that foundation will be rocked. So when we look at spiritual lenses, I think it's really important that, you know, I'm a firm believer, and it's simple: grace, mercy, and love. And that's what God did for us. That's what Jesus did for us. And that's what we need to do for our communities. And as we understand people coming into our church, which we will, you will see broken people. You can see by personalities how they may make a comment, how they may not talk at all, how there might be eye rolling or eye looking or, you know, whatever. Before we react to that, as leaders, we have to say, that person is a broken person who has a spiritual lens that may have been built on sand. And our job is to say, okay, boy, that was a stupid comment. No, it wasn't. Our job is not to say that was a stupid, stupid comment, but our job is to look past the comment and say, how can I get this person to see people through grace, mercy, and love? That's our role. Now, there's times where people will blurt out something and you're like, holy crap, did they just say what they just said? And you think, how am I going to fix that? Or how am I not going to react to that and say, are you kidding me? Blah, 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 blah. But in our reality, we have to go above, have that 30,000-foot peak and look down and say, okay, in reality, that person or persons or that group or that reaction, we have to say, how can we as leaders help them see grace, mercy, and love? Help them see it through the eyes of Christ. That should be the first thing that comes out of our mouths. I think that's a very hard thing. But when we start practicing saying those things, like how would Jesus deal with it, which I know, so what, you know, what, WWJD, yeah, what would Jesus do? In reality, to be honest with you, that's not a bad thing to think about. What would Jesus do? You know, would he eye roll? No, I don't think he would. Would he have gotten up and walked over to that woman who was standing in the front of that sanctuary, totally in her glory as she's worshiping, and would have stood next with her? You know, I kicked myself. I was way in the back doing this. Thinking, go girl, go! What I should have done is walked my butt down, as a leader of the church, walked my butt down there and sat right next to her and lifted my arms up and worshiped with her. Next time, right? It's a learning curve. It's an absolute learning curve. Legalism, you know, legalism's been around forever. If you look at the Bible, if you're a theological student of it, all of the Old Testament is primary legalism. All the New Testament is Jesus reacting to legalism. And then Jesus says, okay, this is your job. React. When we talked about modeling, Jesus modeled love, grace, and mercy, but he also modeled what? He argued against legalism all the time. He talked to it, face to face to it, didn't hesitate to speak up. That's a model that we don't talk about in seminary. We don't really talk about, we talk about teaching and preaching, we don't really talk about healing. But healing, 77% of Jesus' ministry was physical, emotional, and spiritual healing. So it's a trifecta, there's three. But the piece that we don't talk a lot about is how Jesus constantly bucked the system. What a hero. That's our job as leaders. We are to look and say, you know what? That's the world coming in. We have to have sacred space. We have to have a space that people do not feel like they're competing with the real world outside. We had a youth group situation, and I won't name it, but it was a very remarkable situation I got to be a part of. And we had multiple churches involved, and we created one youth group. And multiple denominations, 6, 7 churches, all of it. A very remarkable experience. The sad thing came out of it, it became very big, okay, which is good. I mean, big is good, I guess, in some ways. I don't see it all the time, but we had a lot of kids coming, and what started to happen is I started watching, as I was trying to help coach the leaders in this, is that you had to be aware of the fringe. Fringe is everywhere. As adults, there's fringe, people who hang out on the outside of the walls, the wallflower, whatever. There's kids, there's fringe, and it was amazing how quickly that this safe, sacred community started to look like your everyday place, like if you were outside at a school and you started seeing the cliques and the shapes and sizes that went together. The skateboarders on one, the blonde bombshells on the other, the long hair tattooers over. I mean, it was just all of a sudden that dynamic started to happen. And then on top of that dynamic, then you had the fringe. And how easily, you're juggling. You've been programming. When you're programming, I mean, you can barely keep up, let alone, and then to take time just to, fringe, I gotta get those fringe, and I've gotta separate those groups, and it was amazing how quickly this wonderful concept of loving God and being, Jesus, the body, went into a secular venue. I mean, it was like carbon copy. And the biggest thing is like, how did we undo that? How did it get there? And then how do we undo it? But churches model that same behavior. I watched a couple people come in. Start looking when you start coming in. Start looking at people who may be your fringe, who've been here a long time and are not talked to. Or maybe start looking at people who do walk in. And it's like, what do they do with themselves? And, we shouldn't be staring at them too long, but really watch. You'll be finding that our churches, all of us, tend to leave people hanging in our communities. And that's a form of abuse. It's saying, yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, we love you. Yeah, come in. We want to talk to you. You don't look right. Go away from me. I don't have time. Or people who take up too much time when you open that conversation. And I dread that sometimes when it's like, if I open that door, I'm going to be here for 5 minutes. Well, my Sunday morning, I'm going to tell you flat out, I got stuff to do. Really? Really? Is my stuff that I'm doing is more important than this person who probably doesn't talk to anybody during the week, and I get my 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes of, which one's more important? Getting my stuff done so my classroom looks good, or allowing this woman to feel the heart of mercy, grace, and love? As soon as I walk by that person, pretend I didn't see that person, I've just spiritually abused that person in my church. That's a toughie. Because I don't abuse people. Not me. I'm a pastor. I'm good at what I do, right? We do it all the time. So I think the thing is that when we have this situation, we realize that no box got in, and really hear that formally. For us to understand God, we will put him in a nice little box that makes sense to us. That's religion. That's how we cope. But God says, you know what? Don't box me in. Don't box me. Let me be mercy, grace, and love. Just let me be that. And then anything else outside of that, if you need to do that to understand me, do it. But then when you realize the truth of who I am, let the truth set you free. John 8:31-32 says, abide in my word, know who I am. And when you do know who I am, the truth will set you free. And it's not my truth, it's the heart of God. It's love, mercy, and grace. So when we love people in our community, whether it be kids, if we want our kids to behave with love, mercy, and grace, we've got to model that. If we want our adults to behave love, mercy, and grace, we've got to model that. We've got to show them how to do it. We hold their hand. Ben and I were just talking about this. You almost have to hold that person's hand and say, I'm going to show you how it's done. And say, June, I'd like you to meet Jeff. June used to be blah, 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 blah. Jeff used to do blah, 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 blah. And you put them together and you walk away. Because when we expect our adults to do it, we think that's a normal expectation. Kids are much better at it than adults. Adults are so fearful to stretch out, to get out of their comfort zone. So when we talk about the abuse situation, we really, really, really have to model that. If that's not your job in your church community, which I think it's everybody's job, but that's something too when you go back and you do your teachings and you start sharing this information, model behavior is the core solution to getting rid of abusive situations at a church. And the only way to do it is through us as leaders. And like I said, you think adults would get it. Jesus constantly spoke it, taught it, lived it out loud. We have to live it out loud as well. We really do. Any questions so far? So table talk, really quickly, I think what I'd like to do is on page 4, we'll take maybe 5 minutes or something. It can be in a small group here. But have you ever experienced yourself being punched by God personally? Or have you witnessed a community that's been punched by God, or an individual that might have experienced that? And what did that look like? How did that feel if you observed it or experienced it? And then the second question is if you had a chance to describe rock spirituality and sand spirituality, where are you kind of in your world? Is it rocky sand, sandy rock? Are you rock? Exactly, depends on the minutes. And one of the reasons why I want you to bring to light what spirituality or being punched by God looks like, which I say that tongue-in-cheek because that's true, is because when we have a picture of what that looks like, we are able to advocate for change. When we have a feeling of what that looks like, an understanding, an empathetic, compassionate understanding of what it looks like to be punched by God or spiritually abused, then we are better advocates in the change process. So that's one of the reasons why if you don't have one, you don't have to have one. Good for you if you don't. But if you have something that allows you to resonate or witness with somebody, that will allow you to maybe say, okay, this is what we're advocating against. So maybe it's story time, I don't know. Do you have a story?
I'm actually kind of curious, this child that was called in your church, was it on a spiritual issue, or it was just
physical?
Yeah. So it didn't actually, in some ways, it didn't actually relate directly to the faith in any way. It was strictly a.
Yeah.
No, but what's very interesting is the particular child that it happened to, that and not saying this is the only instance it's ever occurred, it was the instance that was brought to my attention, is very new to the church.
Yeah.
And has never been to church in his life. Here I have a 9-year-old boy who is discovering God for the first time and
loves it.
Love it.
No idea how he lived without the church for the first 9 years
Yeah,
of his life.
and for me to sit across a table from one of my best friends in the world who is experiencing this renewal of the faith that she once held so dearly and lost for so long, and to watch her bring her son into this and him cling so dearly to it and love it so much, and experience this physical threat that made him not want to come back. The bullying didn't happen per se on this spiritual level. It happened on a physical level. But how that affects
his spirituality.
his spirituality very much plays into it. And feeling that it wasn't a safe space anymore, that this sacred space had suddenly become unsafe, I think profoundly affects spirituality.
And then how do you, I guess the challenge is, if there was only one child involved in that physical abuse, how you bring that child back to, or if they have called it, to the grace mercy love and peace. So there's two kids to worry about, really.
Right.
Actually,
Right.
the whole
The whole group.
because what happens is one exits, even though they may not know why a child is exited, the rest of the community of kids are like, so-and-so's not here anymore. There's a ripple effect that goes far deeper just by people not being in position when they first started.
Especially in middle school, because
Yeah.
that's when your peer group starts to become more important than anybody else. That's, you're starting,
And we're gonna go into some solutions. This back thing is, I really wanna share some of those solutions. But yeah, that's a very hard thing, so he's not back.
Has not been back since. And there's been some extenuating circumstances
Sure.
with the rest of the family and things like that. But I think that also plays into it.
And that's hard. And it's,
I think we'll reconcile that.
Yeah, it's not something I think Ben and I have talked about this, it's not something that's okay, and it's something that we have to address. Because if it's happening one place, it's happening other places.
absolutely.
And just because I heard about it, and I encourage very much, if you hear about it too, there's maybe not a lot, there's some that I can do, but I can't be there every week.
Yeah.
I can't watch the interactions of people within that room every week. I mean, I can never really be there. I'm in another classroom all of the time. For me, I think the one thing I could do was ensure those people that we would not stand for it and that it was not okay, and encourage them to, I very much encouraged her to come to Ben, to talk to Ben, because you can do something. You can do more about it than I can. He can be eyes and ears in the room. I can't be.
Right.
And to let people know that it was happening. So that we can have those conversations with the parents, we can have those conversations with the kids, because I think those all need to happen.
Right. And I think the thing is, it is what it is. It happened. So, yes, it might be embarrassing. Some situations might be more embarrassing than in a bully situation, but you have to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that's a misnomer in bullying, whether it be kid or adult, is, oh, they'll figure it out.
Right.
Wrong. It doesn't work that way. And adults now need to step in. We grew up, including you guys too, I'm sure, we grew up where it's like, figure it out. It's just kid stuff, you guys gotta figure it out. And the sad thing is the stakes are too big, the stakes are too high. Obviously, we're seeing things that, suicide, cutting, for adults, drinking, self-medicating, it just goes on and on and on. I don't care if you're a little person or a big person, the aftermath is huge. So,
But I also think our job as adults is to step in and equip kids with the tools to help them figure it out. Not to solve the problem for them,
Right.
but to make them part of that process and teach them that process.
Right.
So that if it happens again, or when they see it happening to someone else,
They can speak to it.
those kids can speak to it.
Yeah, yeah. Or go get help. You know, I
Right.
think that's where the big thing is, to go get, how do you go get help?
To know, yeah.
Yeah, pulling this back, unless you have more to say about that particular incident, I'm thinking in terms of bullying, I've seen this happen twice now in my ministry, and they both happen at business meetings on the adult level, where you have an individual who's the first to stand up and say, I will not vote for this, okay? And that is a true form of bullying. What I found interesting was the spiritual aspect that you were bringing up, because in that instance, even though that individual never left the church, I was never able to ever, and he was the leader on the search committee who called me. I was never that person's pastor, never, out of the 4.5 years I was there. And it was very sad, because I've seen people lose position of power in a church before. I'd seen that through my own in-laws, and it's a sad thing, because generally they're in leadership because of their abilities and so forth. And then most recently was this year at our business meeting, a person who has had a long-standing voice on holding the group back, meaning the congregation back, from moving more intently into social justice issues. Again, as we were creating a social justice ministry, honoring it, we have a person who we've actually called for that position, who is from the congregation, has a passion of social justice action. So it just seemed logical that we need to give honor to a piece of where we want to go as a congregation anyway. Again, this person who's had a long-standing voice about hesitating to move in that direction, again, immediately was the first person up. I think this is wrong, blah, 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 blah. And they've left.
Yeah.
I mean, they sent me a note and said, by August, we'll have found a new church. And now, from that standpoint, I think that's going to be a positive move for us. But I'm thinking in the sense of that spiritual brokenness that happens to the bully.
Right, right.
Okay?
You know,
So it's not just the congregation.
no, it's the bully, it's the victim. Everybody's coming, we're brokering ourselves and positioning ourselves to God and for God through our brokenness. It's the only lens we have. So what we're really called to, which is in the back of this booklet, is how do we heal? How do we learn how to heal? How do we help people identify themselves in love? How do people learn to understand themselves as God understands them, and start owning that identity? You know, you might have heard spiritual identity scriptures, things of that nature. But if we start, you know, really like the airplane view, you know, what's the biggest problem? They don't understand who they are in relationship to God. So if we can get people to understand their true identity in God, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, you know what? I don't have to look through shattered glasses anymore. I don't have to look through the lens of brokenness. And you, as the person looking in, as a leader looking in, Steve, and all that, you can start saying, how can I help that person see mercy, grace, and love for themselves, for the people in front of them? And how can I teach them? Which is really, and again, this is it's lofty, because when you're in the heat of stuff, how many people do you want to throttle? I've been there. I've wanted to throttle a few, or I'm from the inner city of Detroit. I grew up very, very different, very poor. I was a minority most of my life. If anybody saw 8 Mile, that movie, that was Mansionville compared to where I grew up. So my perspective of solving a problem is like, let me tell you, you know. So I think we really have to think bigger And when people are snapping or creating difficulties, it's because there's fear right in it, and fear creates a lot of chaos in people, or past experiences, you know. But I agree with that. I mean, and again, and we'll just pray before we leave. I want to make sure we pray over you guys for that, because that's a biggie. That's going to change your culture. Does anybody else have an example or a story that they'd like to share with the group before we go on? Professionally, I have one. I was in a situation as a church leader, one of the associate pastors, and I had kind of an associate, I don't know how to describe it, not head pastor, but just about. There was two in that position. But this one individual was over me in my area of ministry. And because he was so fearful of my relationship with the head pastor, he would isolate me from meetings, and or decisions would be made that I knew nothing about. Or, you know, I ran a preschool and with part of the ministry as a church outreach. And I later found out that this individual took all credit for all the work that had been done in curriculum and, you know, hiring and, you know, all of this. And so I was like, I had no idea. I felt always pushed out. And being a woman, past, you know, and kind of, for people who are women in leadership, it's tough. UCC is just a blessing because it's not about gender. You know, it's about being good at what you do and what you are in the field. But there are a lot of church communities don't exist that way. So I spent a lot of time in my 6-year relationship with this individual not realizing that I was being spiritually abused at a level that literally boxed me into a place where I questioned everything I did. I became nervous. I became emotionally depressed. I started second-guessing everything I did and didn't do for fear that, is this person going to like it, not like it? What am I going to have to do? Then when I later started finding out that my work was being taken, you know, literally, you know, and who do I go to? I was in situations where there were, you know, fat jokes and big-breasted jokes and, you know, all the thing that I am. You know, this started going on, and this was under the leadership of the church. And for me to keep my job as an associate, I had to stay quiet. And I think the weirdest thing is I stayed quiet for so long is because I honestly didn't think that this stuff happened in a church. So as I was experiencing it, I wasn't putting a face to it. I didn't know what it looked like. I just thought, gosh, I'm really having a hard time working with this person. What is it about me that, what am I doing? You know, blah, 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 blah. As, you know, Ben Guest said, you know, the last thing we want to do is feel stupid as leaders. I think that's the worst thing we can do. And I don't care if you're in seminary or have a passion for God. We as leaders, we're all the same. You know, look at the disciples. Not one of them was an educated soul. They were all like average Joes getting plucked out of like, come on, let's go, we got stuff to do. They're like, okay, we're on it. That's how we should look at ministry. We're all average Joes doing God's work. And I think that was the hardest thing when I finally realized what had happened. It felt like rape. And it took it was like, I remember all of a sudden out of nowhere, I was in the middle of a meeting and I was on the phone and I went back to my office to get something and it hit me like a rock what it was. And, you know, and I had a sexual assault when I was very, you know, younger. And so when I started connecting the abuse, I started realizing this is really prevalent. You know, and how we treat each other and how we take credit for each other or discredit each other. And so when we think of abuse or bullying, it happens at all age levels. It happens co-professionally. It happens with your community members, such as the kitchen lady or the person who can say, no, I don't want that. You know, it's a form of control. When we can spiritually control somebody, and with the spiritual decision, that is being punished by God or spiritual abuse. And to recognize the different levels. I think that's the part that I was really amazed by, is that my perspective was kid bully. I didn't think adults did it. We do much more damage than actually kids. We're much sneakier. If we have an agenda, we're abusing. If you're trying to create something that, without being forthright and open, we're abusing. And that's hard.
I think you could have an agenda without the abusing.
Exactly, you can, but if you're using it as,
It's how you present it.
it's how you present it. Thank you, thank you.
Because
Everybody's got an agenda, you know, but when we have, this is how I pretty much mark an idea that if I'm abusing a situation. If I have anger, frustration, angst about it, whatever, need to control it, whatever I'm feeling, that to me is more of a spiritual abuse tactic than I have an agenda, this is my passion, this is what I love, here's the grace, mercy, and love meaning behind it, blah, 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 blah. That's a way to go about your agenda. But when we're over here on this side with issues of control, fear, frustration, anything that's not of God, you know, when I look at, Galatians 5:22, the fruits of the Spirit. If we start working the opposite of the fruits of the Spirit, we're working on a negative agenda. If the negativity is aligning us into that direction, pushing us into that conversation. We really should be about the fruits of the Spirit, and be in a good dialogue, and okay to disagree. But again, it all comes down to learning how to communicate. Again, the 30,000